This is the IBJ podcast for the week of Monday, August 26th, 2024, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. We received sobering news last week from the Indiana Business Research Center at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. Between 1990 and 2020, the population of Indiana grew by more than 1.2 million people. Now, I'm not going to say the population growth is inherently good, but it does help solve economic problems. A bigger base of potential employees and customers tends to attract more businesses and expand the tax base, which then can fund more public services and amenities, which then can attract more people. But we learned from the IBRC that Indiana is headed into a steep decline in population growth that could reach a period of near zero growth by the 2050s. In fact, more than two-thirds of Indiana's 92 counties will see losses in population over the next 30 years. Now, this can be explained by a grim but relatively simple phenomenon. The number of deaths in the state will begin surpassing the number of births in the 2040s. At that point, migration from other states will account for all of Indiana's population growth, putting pressure on officials across the state to make Indiana as appealing a place to live as possible. Now, here's the news for those of us in central Indiana. The 11-county Indianapolis metro area is expected to add residents at a relatively robust clip over several decades. In fact, the metro area is projected to hit about 2.497 million residents by 2050, an increase of nearly 405 residents from 2020. And the state's 5 fastest growing counties, you probably know them, will be suburban Indianapolis counties. The question now is, what should public officials on the city, county, and state level do with this information? Matt Kinghorn, the principal researcher on the IBRC study, is our guest this week to break down the numbers, explain what's behind these expected trends, dig into the challenges facing the state, and provide a preview for what essentially is a story of two different Indianas. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Matt Kinghorn, Senior Demographer for the Indiana Business Research Center at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. He is down in Bloomington today, so we're talking via Zoom. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure to be with you, Mason.
So I am not a demographer, though I know this is a very complicated and technical process. Can you just give me a taste of how you create these projections, and in particular, how you can project so far into the future with any hope of accuracy?
Basically, it's just extending past trends forward. And so it's really built off of the last 10, 20 years of, census counts, the census to kind of form the base, census data, and then looking at the components of population change, which are just births, deaths, and migration. And so it's looking at the last 10, 15, 20 years of those trends and then applying them forward. You're right that it's technical and there's a lot that goes into it to project out 30, 40 years, but it's really based off of just extending. If the past holds into the future, then this is what things will look like. And so, there can be changes. So that will mean that sometimes these projections can veer off, but that's just because the trends change, life changes. And so you see different things like a pandemic or you see shifts in migration patterns and birth and fertility trends. So that can change things. But so it's basically just if things hold like they have been, this is what we will look like in 10, 15, 20 years.
What is the value of projecting the population of the state, even down to individual counties over the next 35 years?
The biggest utility is for planning for the future. For local communities use these numbers all the way down to school corporations and planning departments and anyone who has to kind of plan for the future, state government in terms of, say, preparing the labor force of the future, that sort of thing. And, businesses rely on this type of information for market analysis, planning for the future, and, even their hiring needs. And so it's really, I consider really basic information for planning. I think that everybody just relies on this type of information, both what's happened in the last 10, 15, 20 years, and then what do we see going forward? And so we get lots and lots of requests for this type of information, and then down to township levels, and everybody wants to know what's going on, and as granular as you can get even.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you would get requests from municipalities or counties.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it can be, anything from libraries, from a lot of schools. This is really critical information for schools. And so everybody has to plan for the future. And population is about as basic information as it gets. Yeah. And so it's pretty critical.
So if we zoom way out on your analysis here, we include the entire state, look nearly 4 decades into the future, we can say Indiana's population will grow 5.6% over the 40-year stretch between 2020 and 2060. And population-wise, that's raw number-wise, that's 6.79 million people to 7.17 million people. On the face of it, that sounds fairly innocuous. But how does that 5 to 6% population growth compare to the previous 40 years, let's say 1980 to 2020?
You're right. It does sound like, well, just continuing chugging along. But our projections for the future are that we're going to see significantly slower growth in the state. And that's a real big takeaway from this analysis, is that the simplest way I can put it is that you say it's about 400,000 growth over the next 40 years. Well, that's less than the growth that we saw between 2000 and 2010. So a 40-year stretch is going to be less growth than what we saw just 10 to 20 years ago between 2000 and 2010. So that's going to be a real dramatic turnaround for the state, something we just have to almost reset our expectations, because we've almost, for our whole lifetimes, we've grown without even trying, basically, right? Because the baby boom generation was so large, so much larger than any generation that came before it. So as they aged, we just continually grew. And so, but now as that baby boom generation is growing older, that easy growth is kind of coming to an end.
It is so helpful to see this in graph form. Yes, I wish we could show this to people, podcast listeners, in graph form.
Yeah.
And you see, when you look, closer at the data, when it's visualized, you get a better sense of how sharply and how quickly the population growth will decline. So, for example, as you point out, 60% of the population gains expected by 2060 are going to take place over the next 6 years.
Right. So, so more than half of that, you say 400,000 growth over 40 years. But more than half of that will happen by 2030. So then we get out, when you look at like you say, visually, it's much easier to see. But when you have to say the 2050s, it shows growth, but that's 40 years from now. So it's essentially flat. It could just as easily be a decline in population at that point, because a lot can change. Or it could be higher. When we look out 20 or 30 years, it's essentially flat growth or flat change, no change. And so when we go back to, you look at the 90s, we grew by more than 500,000 residents in the 90s. In the 2000s, we grew by 400,000. Like I said, more than in the 2000s, more than what we expect to grow over the next 40 years.
Right.
So, and even last decade, more than 300,000 growth.
And by the 2050s, I'm extrapolating a little bit just from what I saw in the graph, but you projected net population growth of less than 1,000 people per year.
Right. And so that's such a fine margin.
Super alarming, though I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's right. And this isn't unique to Indiana. You can look at the Census Bureau released their projections for the nation just a few months ago. And it's a similar pattern. And they go out to all the way to 2100. And we start to see for the nation, for the country as a whole, they project population decline starting in the 2060s, 2070s.
Actual decline.
So, right.
Like in the raw population.
Right.
Wow.
And so this is, I'm sure we'll get into it. I just mentioned it is the baby boom generation, the aging of the baby boom generation has a lot to do with this, but there are other factors, more recent kind of factors in fertility and mortality trends that are really exacerbating this change. The aging of the baby boom generation, we've known about this for a long time. Demographers have been pointing out for decades that we will see slowdown in population growth because as population ages. So that's been known, but the pace of that slowdown has really picked up steam here in the last 10 to 20 years. And so that's what these projections show, that, we may see that those trends kind of mellow a little bit, hopefully, and maybe even rebound some, but it's still fertility and mortality trends are going in the wrong direction in terms of population growth, at least.
Yeah. On the very basic level, I understand it like this way, that Indiana has long relied on births, on new Hoosiers for population growth. But by the 2040s, more elderly Hoosiers or more Hoosiers will die then Hoosier babies will be born.
That's will outnumber births by the 2040s, right?
Yeah. Fewer births, more deaths.
Right.
And then that leaves us with the number of people who decide to come live in the state. And that is your source of population growth.
That's right. And so, I think maybe I'm just highlighting my own blind spots here, but I think a lot of people think that population growth is migration, right? But it really isn't. It is what's called natural increase. And that's that number, the difference between the numbers of births and numbers of deaths. And it's always been, a natural increase has always been the dominant source of growth in the state. And so even if we go last decade, when, between 2010 and 2020, when births were on the decline and we had pretty strong net migration to the state, natural increase still accounted for 70% of our population growth. So it is still by far the dominant source of population growth in the state just last decade. But 20 years from now, it will go from being the dominant source of growth to a drag on growth. And so that is a tremendous change in the state and in our population.
Yeah. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm going to pick on the boomers here for a second.
Yeah.
So right now, the boomers are between the ages of 60 and 78, I understand. Right. Within 10 years, so the entire baby boom population will be older than the typical retirement age of 65. And 1 out of every 5 Hoosiers will be a senior citizen. I don't know if that's a pejorative term now, but that's what we used to call them. Senior citizen. If we just look at that statistic, what kind of stress does having 20% of your state's population past retirement age exert on the state and on your economy?
Obviously, there's how do we support in terms of social programs and healthcare, and how do we support a growing size of retirement population? And that's going to put a lot of pressure on the existing labor force and on factors like productivity growth, because our labor force is not going to grow, and not nearly to the extent of our size of our population outside of the labor force. And so that's going to put a lot of pressure on income gains and productivity growth to help support that population and support the programs that they rely on. And then it's going to, in terms of just certain industries, obviously it's going to have a big impact on healthcare and on housing to make sure that we have the housing needed to, and the type of support services needed to support that population.
Honestly, when I first saw the results of the analysis, I was like, oh, great. They're going to be, we're not going to have 12 million people, right?
Right.
I'm like, hey, this is wonderful. There are too many people here already. We're going to have to. So I was thinking, what is so bad about the state's population growth slowing to a crawl? Now that I've had a chance to think about it, I think I get it.
When we look at this population, and you think about it from the perspective of, say, our employers. And so, we're talking about population growth, but this really translates into labor force as well. We do labor force projections as well. And so, when we look at the future over the last 40 years or so, we have the size of India's labor force has grown by about 210,000 workers per decade. When we look over the next 40 years, it's going to be, about 130 or so, total growth of about 130,000 workers over the next 40 years. It's going to be tough competition to attract young adults to the state, because I think our employers are going to need them. And so it's just a dramatic shift that they're going to run into.
We talk about the labor force all the time on the podcast because, it is a factor in literally almost every story we do now.
Right.
And we talk a lot about the fact that, we have, the jobs up here and then we have the workforce down here. And sometimes the people in the workforce don't have the skills that they need for these kinds of jobs that pay really well. That would get you out of, the low income situation or middle income situation. So what I've always taken from that is, you need to increase the number of people who can take those high-end jobs to help advance your economy.
Oh yeah, it's critical. So I know that a lot of our major employers need that, and that's why you see not just looking for better education outcomes here in Indiana and around the country, but also looking to really around the world to try to bring in the type of workers they need. And so you see that a lot. I was just reading an article the other day about. Look at a community like Columbus, Indiana, where immigration has really driven growth there. It's been a strong growing population in Bartholomew County. And a lot of that is driven by immigration. A lot of it's driven by Cummins and other groups really, sponsoring, bringing people in from abroad to fill those jobs and that really high skilled technical engineering types of jobs. It's incumbent on our state and the country to make sure that we have that we grow the kind of skills here in the U.S. and that we make a kind of an immigration system that matches the needs of our employers, I think.
Let's take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ podcast and my conversation with Matt Kinghorn about projections for Indiana's population growth, or lack thereof. I just want to make sure I didn't misspeak before. So we're saying that the Indiana labor force over the next decades, there will be smaller gains as opposed to shrinking.
Well, it depends on how far you go out. And so it's kind of like when you look at that population figure, we look at our projection. So in the 2040s and the 2050s, that we could actually see a decline in the size of our labor force.
Oh, no kidding.
So we're looking at much smaller growth over the next 10 to 20 years, and potentially even declines beyond that point in the size of our labor force.
So just from a policy perspective, right, it would behoove us to find ways to be more appealing to people between, let's say, the ages of like 25 and 55.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'll steal a line from the director here at the IBRC, Carol Rogers. She'll tell anybody that she sees that states are really increasingly in a brutal competition for young adults. And it is because the way I think about it, any organization or institution that is, tasked with training our future labor force or with attracting people to the state or anything of creating, the foundations we need to succeed, their efforts have never been more consequential than they are now. And they only prove to be more and more consequential just because the margins are getting so much finer in terms of that labor force growth and in having the skills and the talent that our employers need. And so it's becoming more, increasingly important.
I was struck by a statistic from your analysis that showed the mortality rate for people between 25 and 54 increased significantly from 1998 to 2019.
Yes.
And what was driving that?
The biggest driver there is addiction, drug overdose. Would be, this is something that gets talked about a lot when you hear people might be familiar with the terms deaths of despair. So that's something that's been, when you look at Indiana, our total life expectancy kind of peaked in 2010, which is somewhat unbelievable, and has been declining since then. And that's driven by what's been happening with, what I always would call the working age adults. And so, we saw between 1998 and 2019, like you referenced, I think about a 25% increase in mortality rate for population in that age group. And things have obviously have not gotten any better.
So 2010, was it the average, what do we call it, age of death?
Life expectancy.
Life expectancy. Thank you.
Yeah, right.
It was like about 77.5, 77.6.
Right.
And it since has declined by about a year or so.
Right.
How does that stack up against like the national mortality?
Not well. We're typically about 2 years lower than the national life expectancy. And so, but that is a gap that has widened and widened over time. So if you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, we're about equal with the U.S. And so over that period, over these 20 to 30 years, there has been we've really fallen behind, and we fall behind more and more each year. So okay. That's a sad story on that.
If we're again looking at that period from 98 to 19, so that doesn't take into account the pandemic. Right.
That's kind of why I always a lot of times will on these statistics kind of stop at 2019, see where we were in 2019, and then where we are since. And so if you look at compare, say, 2023 to 2019, in terms of that mortality rate for the 25 to 54 group, we're about 6% higher now than we were in 2019. In between then, we had a very large spike. And so we were much higher in 2021, 2022 or so. Some of that had to do with the pandemic. A lot of that had to do with a real escalation of the drug overdose crisis. So it's still obviously it's a crisis in the state for sure.
Now, the slowdown in population growth will not hit like each area of the state equally. Where will the slowdown in population growth be the most apparent within the state?
Well, large swaths of the state are going to see a decline basically in population, at least according to these projections. And so, that includes at least most of our rural and mid-sized communities. So really, we just see it's been a story for the last 20 or 30 years that we've seen just a handful of metro areas kind of driving all the growth in the state. And these projections show that that's expected to continue. And so if you look, say, last decade, if you look at the census results from 2010 to 2020, more than half of our counties, or about 50 counties, saw a population decline just last decade. That should go up to somewhere 65 to 70 counties. By the time we look out 20, 30 years, we'll be declining.
And is that strictly because of I've already forgotten what the term is for deaths outpacing births? It's just
natural increase
increase. It's actually a natural decrease.
Right. Well, no, that's certainly the biggest change. And so, but there's also been some out-migration from these communities as well. And so natural increase had kind of masked that for a long time in terms of just looking at the total population number. But now with the aging of the population, it no longer masks that. And now a lot of counties, even before the pandemic, were also a natural decrease, meaning that deaths had outnumbered births. So when you're relying only on migration as your only source of growth, then a lot of places are going to see an out-migration. And a lot of times for normal reasons, for high school students going away to college or retirees moving elsewhere or something like that. So for a lot of communities, attracting residents is going to be huge.
So the dynamics, as I think you were pointing out, are going to be really different for metropolitan areas. My impression from the research was that the 11 county Indianapolis metro area will grow substantially in population over the next until even 2050.
Right. Looking at the numbers, it will even outgrow the state. Right. Mm-hmm. And so the total population growth in central Indiana, or that Indy metro area, is expected to be larger than what we see in the state. And then so obviously that means that the rest of the state as a whole will actually see some population decline over that period. Right. But so strong growth continuing in central Indiana.
Yeah. So the figure that I saw between 2020 and 2050 in the 11 county metro area, we'll see an increase of more than 400,000 people, which is about 20-ish% increase over that time. So that would take central Indiana to about 2.5 million people. Mm-hmm.
And so if you just look at it on a share basis right now, that 11 county region, the Indy metro area, is about 30% or 31% of the state's population. And so by 2050, it's up to about 35% of the population.
Why is all the growth happening in the metro areas?
Well, I mean, it's just something, that we've seen for a long time is that metro areas are the engine of growth. Not just, this isn't just an Indiana story, but something we see around the country. And so metro areas, because with diverse economies, diverse industrial base, they can attract a lot of workers to the area. And so that's attractive. Also other things, certain, schools and whatnot, that, perception of strong schools and all that can also be a big draw to those communities. And so it's something that we expect to see happen, but it's kind of turned a lot of things on its head. And one thing is, these, like I mentioned, these projections are based off of 10, 20 years of data and kind of projecting those patterns forward. But something that we've seen in the last couple of years in the population estimates are something of a kind of a rural rebound or a mid-size community rebound. And so we've seen more growth and more people moving into areas that they hadn't moved to before. And so whether or not that's sustainable, I don't know. My hope is that, not that I'm rooting for any community over another, but my hope is that when we redo these numbers in a couple of years, maybe those trends are sustained and we can start to project out, maybe a brighter picture for some of these areas. And so I hope it's a sustainable trend, because I think it's good for the state to see a more broadly distributed population growth.
I don't want to freak out our friends in the donut counties, but according to the research here, the 5 fastest growing counties will be suburban Indianapolis counties. And those are Hamilton, Hendricks, Johnson, Hancock, and Boone. Each one will grow by at least 25% in population by 2050. I'm going to single out Hamilton here for a second. Currently, actually, the 2020 census, they were just under 350,000. By 2050, you've got them at more than 525,000.
Right. At which point that'd be the second largest county in the state. Yeah.
And then what happens with Marion County?
Continuing to grow, finally getting over the 1 million mark at some point, but slower growth. I think that the number is 35,000 total growth over that period. It's a little bit of a change for them. I talked about the last few years, the growth, where we were seeing kind of that rural rebound. Well, that's at the expense of more urban areas. And so, Marion County has seen population decline over the last 3 years, and it's a net out migration, pretty strong net out migration from the county. We don't expect that to be obviously continue on, because last decade was a completely different story. The decade before that was a different story. And so we think that the longer run trends are probably going to win out. but it's not as strong a growth as we would have projected maybe last time, when we did these projections back in 2018 or so.
Is it partially due to the lack of developable land? I know, some townships, are basically, there's no entry point anymore for new homeowners.
Right. No, you can reach a saturation point there, but a lot of things can feed into it. With the growing acceptance of hybrid work situations or even remote work situations, distance isn't the barrier that it once was. Housing costs and housing availability is another big issue. I think we've seen, as a state, we've seen a real big increase in household formation rates the last few years. And with that, and with housing costs and with housing shortages in certain areas, I think people are starting to look at maybe other communities, other markets that they hadn't in the past. And so I think that, a combination of factors may be driving people to look elsewhere. You highlight Hamilton County and Boone County and kind of the usual suspects in growth, but in other areas, Madison County, and we're talking about Pendleton and Anderson area there, they're starting to see growth, and they've been declining for decades. And so they're starting to see some development there in southern Madison County. Or if you look at just last year, the fastest growing community in the state, at least communities of at least 1,000 residents, was Monrovia, which is in Morgan County.
You are kidding.
And so, yeah, no, and that's a fast growing community with a lot of development. And so I think that people are, looking at different communities than maybe they had in the past. And housing costs and housing supply, I think, are playing into that.
Wow, go Monrovia. That's amazing.
Right. It is, yeah. It's a small community, so that's why a relatively, an increase that you would notice in Carmel or Brownsburg or whatever is a big increase in Monrovia, right? And so, but still, it's a significant change. And so, and you still see that, and you think of the Carmels and Brownsburgs and Greenwoods and all that, but really the fastest growing communities are Westfield and McCordsville and Bargersville and Monrovia and others like that.
Yeah, so pushing farther out. Yeah, right. Kind of like the gateways to more rural parts of the state. Like I always pass through Monrovia when I'm kind of on my way to like the state parks and the lakes that are on the west side of the state. Right. And yeah, it's absolutely charming. So a question again about the folks 25 to 54. You may have already kind of answered this, but what attracts this highly valued demographic? I'm assuming, for example, schools.
Right. Schools are key, but I think biggest is housing is huge. And so that's going to be a big one. Housing, schools, and then, there's all the quality of life amenities, which I know is a priority for a lot of communities, a priority for the state. And so I think that those are all avenues that we need to pursue to attract those young adults. But, I think, housing, there was a brief period there in 2021, 2022, where people had higher savings and whatnot. And for a lot of young adults, they applied that savings to buying a home. Mm-hmm. And so we had seen for say the population 25 to 40 or so, we had seen home ownership rates decline sharply since 2000, the last 20 years. Just in that couple of year period, we saw a real sharp jump in home ownership rates for young adults. And so I think having affordable or attainable housing for that age group is going to be a big draw.
I want to give a shout out to Clark, Warwick, Allen, and Bartholomew counties. They are expected to grow by at least 10%.
Yes. By
2050. And these have sizable metros in them. Clark is across the river from Louisville. Warwick is next to Evansville, if not Evansville. Allen, of course, includes Fort Wayne, and Bartholomew includes Columbus.
Right. So that just goes to show that it's not just central Indiana, but it's other metro areas that are also growing. So it is that proximity to metro areas or to major employers like a Bartholomew County has. That is key. You see some other what might be more rural counties, but they have real established industrial bases. And so one that always stands out to me is Du Bois County, Jasper, or you see up Warsaw and Kosciuszko County. But these are places with well established, thriving industrial bases in them.
So, I don't know if you can comment on this or not, but if I'm a state legislator, I now feel like I'm being torn in two different directions. So part of me wants to put more resources into Indiana's rural counties that help preserve their tax bases, give families more options for schools and good employment. And then part of me wants to sink more resources in the metro areas because these seem to have the greatest shot at attracting productive members of the labor force. Is there a right strategy?
How about both? I don't have an answer to that, but I'm hopeful that a lot of these are rural and mid-sized communities can see some rebound. And I hear a lot about, well, if our total population is declining, the sky's falling and all that. But, and for a lot of communities, you may not be able to stop that. You may not be able to go from population decline to total population growth. But it's really that focus, I think, on the young adults, on that. What can we do to really turn the corner, bend the line a little bit on those young adults? Can we get a few more entrepreneurs in the community? So it's just affecting that one population. So you may still see some total population decline because that is just kind of the overwhelming demographic situation, the size and structure of our populations. But what can we do to support those age groups? So not just attract new ones and all that, but also what can we do? We talked about those mortality rates earlier. What can we do to support people in those age groups as well who may be susceptible to falling into addiction or maybe are currently addicted? And it all plays a role. Public health, I think, is economic development and workforce development and population growth and all that. And we haven't talked much about fertility rates either, but what can we do to the extent that anybody it may be a financial situation or an economic security situation that is contributing to declining fertility.
What does fertility rate mean exactly?
A measure of the number of births per the childbearing age group. So between the ages of basically 20 and 44. So it's just a measure of what the birth trends are. And so in Indiana, it's in and around the country, it's in sharp decline. I think, last year we had the fertility rate was the lowest fertility rate on record. And so, which almost certainly means it's the lowest fertility rate in the state's history. So, and even if we look at total number of births, it's the third lowest count in the states, going back to World War II, basically. Only 2020 and I think somewhere in 1987, I think were lower. And so we're seeing births and fertility rates sharply decline.
And then what do we know about Indiana's neighboring states? I mean, we talk about us all being in competition now for productive workers, or Kentucky or Illinois, Michigan or Ohio. I mean, are they sort of in the same boat? We're all kind of the Rust Belt states.
Yeah, very much so. And we tend to outperform our neighbors in terms of population growth and attracting residents. So that's great. Illinois, I think has maybe lost some population over the last few years, and Michigan as well. And, Kentucky, not as much, but we still outgrow Kentucky. We do benefit from having like Chicago and Louisville right on our border. So that definitely, we definitely are able to draw some residents from those communities, especially Chicago. And so we do benefit in that regard. And so, we do tend to outgrow our neighbors.
So when is your next set of projections? Are you done for 10 years?
No, we will do it again probably in 2 or 3 years would be when I would say we'll have the next one's out. And so we'll see, things are changing so rapidly now in these last few years. So I'm eager to update them more often.
So the takeaway from this study, if you could just really encapsulate it, is
be prepared for a big shift in population growth and in labor force growth. And then you can also think about it sequentially and who it might affect. This decline, it will affect enrollments. It'll affect schools and universities, right? And then after that, it will affect the size of the labor force. After that, it could affect housing markets and whatnot. And so the impact of this shift, and that's not even talking about the aging population and caring for that population. This shift will have ripple effects throughout the state and through really every aspect of our lives.
Brilliant. All right. I'm going to hold on to all this information. And then in 3 years, we can see what's next.
All right. Yeah, we'll compare. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for explaining this. This is really fascinating. And obviously, I mean, kind of at the base of everything that we talk about.
It is. It almost goes unnoticed sometimes, but it drives everything too. And so it's important to keep track of, I think.
Again, thanks so much for your time.
All right. Appreciate it, Mason. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again to Matt Kinghorn. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in this week's issue of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, the 800-acre Petersburg generating station has been supplying power to Indianapolis for decades. As AES Indiana prepares to convert the station's coal-burning units to natural gas, questions are surfacing about the ability to meet the state's increasing power needs. IBJ's John Russell has more on this. Also in this week's issue, Susan Orr explores the possible impact of a national proposal to remove medical debt from consumer credit reports. And Daniel Bradley examines how Fortville businesses have been affected by more than a year of intense roadwork on Broadway Street. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. And I will say it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. And we're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is. Just go to ibj.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.